Hello, friend. The mystical American Patriots Society is transmitting to you from beneath 4 million cubic feet of solid granite, in the burning heart of the Yellowstone caldera. This is a variety program for normal sandwich-eating Americans with some concerns about living in a deranged, post-Christian technocracy. So, keep your third eye on the sky and your ear to the ground, as Sumo and Smokestack connect your main brain vein to a higher plane. Are you ready? Stand by.
She packed my bags last night pre-flight. 0 hour, 9 a.m. And I'm gonna be high as a kite by then. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome. Today we have a special show with friend of show Rocketman, who is an actual space engineer man, rocket and space aerospace engineer man. He is a local genius. He designed a satellite from scratch pretty much by himself. Was very annoyed that other people were not helping on the group. I remember.
I was the leader of the group. I was supposed to be teaching them how to do it.
Right. We had a satellite building group, and Rocketman was supposed to be, but he ended up just, it's like a group project where one person does all the work and the other people, that was what it was, but with a satellite. And it was very good. He would be in there like 3 a.m. soldering pieces together and stuff. Very impressive. So, and then he went on to have a career as an aerospace engineer, but left it because of the intense amount of philosophical, what would you call it, sodomy going on there.
Well, when I realized late in grad school that it was that the vast majority of like NASA jobs were funded by socialism, that was a deterrent. And then the year I was graduating, the economy had collapsed, and so there weren't any aerospace jobs anywhere. And so I started doing my hobby in software development full time, and I've been doing that ever since.
Yeah,
and it, as far as I know, it pays better. So
yeah, for sure. So tell us more about all the NASA stuff being fueled by socialism.
Well, the basic concept is the government saying, well, you're gonna go do that. One of the projects I got involved on in undergrad was funded by what's called Space Grant. We had collaborations with other universities. There were internships at Jet Propulsion Lab, and there's some commercial entities involved with space flight. A lot of people say, oh, well, SpaceX is the first commercial space flight. But, Boeing built the space station. It's not like they're not a commercial company. But the money for who pays those people to build the space station, who paid Rocketdyne to build the orbiter for the space shuttle, that money's coming from, and the decisions are being made by NASA, the government. And it doesn't start with JFK saying, I believe the station should dedicate itself before the decade is out to putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. It's just like he believes that.
That's a good
He
JFK
wants that.
version.
I thank you. It's just something he wants. But what did JFK do in his lifetime to compensate the people he paid to build that equipment? He didn't do anything to compensate them for it. He just influenced other people to being okay with him taking their money and not rebelling against the government for it. And when I kind of realized, I would rather do something where the customer says, yes, that's wonderful, I love what you're doing, therefore I'm going to give you compensation for it. I built something, so here you go, I'll trade you for that. And something that the customer finds value. And I really wanted to build something where the customer found it valuable. One of the problems we were tasked with in that early work was I was given the job of defining the science goals for the mission. And I ran into this interesting little problem where it doesn't matter. They were like, well, we need to understand the magnetic field on Mars better. So go define what better means. And it's like, I can tell you I want the magnetic field down to 1/10 of a nanotesla, once every meter at an altitude of 5 centimeters, and we're never going to achieve that with the technology we have. And so what science leads do on lead principal investigators, as they call them, is they try to ride the boundary of something that improves the science that they can convince the government to give them the money to do. And going through grad school and sitting through the programs like, well, here's how you convince the National Science Foundation to give you the money that you live on. It's a really sad, the official recommendation is, well, do some research and find some answers, and then propose to them that you're going to find the answers that you did find, so that while they're funding you, you can do some more research and possibly find some more answers so that you know what you can propose the next time. And it's just like, this is crazy.
It is demoralizing how much of grad school is like learning how to be a salesman to the government.
To the government. And that's the thing. And starting my own business in something entirely different, I'm having to learn how to be a salesman. And it's frustrating and it's difficult, but at least the customer is getting, in the end, they're getting something that's valuable to them, as opposed to some bureaucrat sitting there going, I authorize you to take $1 million. And it's like, why do you get to decide? And then I find that, 31% of my paycheck is being removed every month for other people. It's kind of, some guy in Washington, I'm paying his entire salary through my taxes.
Yeah. Yeah. So we brought Rocketman on to explain the foibles of graduate school programs and research grants, but also he is going to argue in favor of the moon landing because I think he believes in the moon landing. Would that be a fair statement? He's still under globalist control and believes in the moon landing.
I would say that, yes, the moon landing happened. Can I prove it 100% without doubt? No, but all of the attempts to disprove it kind of crumble and fall apart.
Okay.
When you
and the CEO of Earth, number 15, wanted us to bring you on because he said, well, look, here's a real space expert, and he can really argue these things without, just appealing to like, but could they do that? Which is sort of like half of my stuff. But before we start, we were going to ask you this before we got going. What are your own personal paranormal experiences? And do you have, it's okay to say you don't have it.
Define paranormal.
Paranormal / supernatural. Have you ever seen a ghost, a Bigfoot? When you were putting a satellite together, did any space elves come and probe you? Any of that sort of thing?
Well, if you're speaking of supernatural,
have you ever been abducted by aliens and/or probed?
No. I've certainly had a number of miraculous experiences with God, and anything from giving me the right answers on my Calculus 2 final exam for one of the questions. To helping me remove a glass shard that had gotten embedded in the heel of my foot. There's any number of experiences. One time he told me which church to join. And I didn't. I waited a week, and he was just like, "Join." It's like, no. I haven't vetted them properly, and he's like, "Join." Turned out to be the best church I ever joined. So I've had a number of experiences with God. In terms of other supernatural beings, there was one time where I'm fairly convinced that I did encounter, I don't know whether it was an angel or a demon. There wasn't a lot of interaction. I was able to see something that obviously was not physically there. It was very, very terrifying. It did not move towards me or attack me or interact with me in any way, but it was very obvious that it was not actually physically present because there were no shadows cast on it. And I was old enough at the time to be able to look for, are there shadows cast on this thing? I was cognizant enough to check, like, is this just, how you look at a bright light and there's like something that, you look away and there's like a spot there where there's a color. I was able to like, okay, is it one of those? So I moved my eyes away. And just the overall look, it was something that was kind of dressed like a G.I. Joe, and it kind of looked like a lion. It had the head of a lion, and the body was pretty furry, but it was kind of dressed like a G.I. Joe. And I was like, that's not actually here, is it?
I like that you earlier. You're like, what paranormal experiences? Do you mean something like a G.I. Joe Lion Man? Because it's like, oh, okay, that would fall under the G.I. Joe Lion Man. Is generally considered. Most people consider that not in the normal sphere. So it would be in the paranormal sphere. But
no, I've pretty much. I mean, like I know that there's some good angels out there, and even.
Like, so if it's an angel or a demon, why would it be dressed? Why would it be a lion G.I. Joe?
A lot of there's a lot of potential answers to that question, and I don't know which ones for certain. Some psychologists would argue that even with the fact that I was, not necessarily hallucinating, that could have been my subconscious mind manifesting an aspect of myself in some way. If it was in fact an angel, many angels in the Bible are depicted as warriors, and so that could be. Maybe that is how the angel manifested, because it appeared as a warrior. And if it had appeared as a Roman soldier, it would have been too ridiculous. I don't know.
It's too ridiculous for me to come as a Roman soldier. I will come as a lion G.I. Joe.
I mean, if you want, it was terrifying. If you want to, if your goal is to scare someone, and that falls back to the question. I don't know what.
Did it look at you?
It was looking directly at me. Yes.
Then did it communicate anything?
It did not say anything. No.
Did it telepathically communicate anything?
It didn't communicate anything to me other than how scared I was to see it.
How long did this last?
It would have been a few minutes. I woke up in the middle of the night.
Yeah, whoa, dude!
It was a few minutes.
So, like, you woke up in the middle of the night and it's in your room?
It was actually standing beyond. So that at one point, my parents renovated our house. They renovated the attic, and the way to get to the attic, they converted the very large closet in my room into a stairway. And there was a door from my room, which, because I was such a big Star Trek fan, I absolutely insisted that it had to be a pocket door. So it was, sliding.
Right.
And it wasn't automatic, but, at least it was sliding. So one night I forgot to close the pocket door, and I woke up in the middle of the night, and this thing was just beyond the door, standing in the stairwell, looking at me. And from the, lying in my bed, that was the direction that I was facing. So that was pretty terrifying. I was about 10 years old, or probably 11, maybe 12, somewhere in that range. And so I was awake enough and I was aware enough that, I could tell, okay, am I awake or am I dreaming? I'm definitely awake. When you're awake, you can tell.
Yeah.
And there weren't any shadows on it. And it appeared, the coloration was as if it was a cartoon character. There were not like 3-dimensional shape. It wasn't like dark on one side and light on the other. It was solid illumination. And it occurred to me, maybe that's what people meant when they said the angel was glowing. But I can't prove that it was an angel. It just sort of, it's either some sort of supernatural being becoming visible to me, or it was a psychological manifestation of something from my subconscious. So probably. But that's not the kind of thing I can be certain about. It's not the kind of thing I can test. And I prefer to believe things that I can test. I prefer to believe things that I can prove are not false.
I'm just going to believe that forever now. I prefer just to believe that you had an encounter with a lion being, and because see, this is the thing I harp on. Like, what about the things that are, because that sort of stuff is repeatable, which is what we go for in science, just not on demand. It's just the problem.
It's not controllable. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's the thing. What do you do about things that you can't control the conditions for? Is the issue.
Right.
So maybe as a test tonight, when you lay down to bed to go to sleep, try and summon the G.I. Joe Lion Man.
I have often asked God not to get me involved with any more angels. It's just tonight, too terrifying.
Just tonight. Okay, let's all pray. Heavenly Father, please send another G.I. Joe Lion Man to Rocketman as an experiment. Amen. And we all agree that's what's going to happen. So, all right.
Good. You didn't know what you were getting yourself into, Rocketman.
Yes.
Coming on our show.
Well, I have to see now, because when that comes up, I always want to be like, well, what else? Because everyone always has all these thousands of things they never bring up until you talk about them. But we're just going to go into the moon landing. Why? Okay. So I sent you some common, because when we started, Rocketman had never really looked into moon landing hoax truthers. And so he was going to come on, and then he spent the weekend researching it. And he also had dry eye from drinking only Diet Coke.
Coke Zero. Diet Coke is nasty.
Only Coke Zero. If you drink only Coke Zero, like completely only Coke Zero, your eyeballs begin to shrivel up like the Serengeti in your head.
It's nowhere near as bad right now.
Several days.
Yeah, it was literally at one point in my life I was drinking 2 liters of Coke Zero a day instead of water. Ooh. And it just completely dried me out. And
6 liters of Coke Zero a day.
Yeah, like I'd get a 2 liter with breakfast, and I would drink that until lunch, and then I'd get another 2 liter, and I would drink that until dinner, and I'd get another 2 liter, and I would drink that until I went to bed. And I finally stopped that cold turkey, and I slept for 2 days. Yeah, so
this is the standard aerospace diet, by the way. Like, what was the name? You know, there were those 2 facilities out where there was JPL. And there's that other one. And the JPL guys were sort of skinny because they had to walk up and down a mountain all the time. But the other one was in a desert and flat. I don't remember its name. It was like Gold something. And they were all just morbid. Yeah. The Goldstone scientists were just morbidly obese.
Most of them.
Because they didn't have any hills. It was all flat. And it was 1,000 degrees outside in the middle of Death Valley. And so they would just go from air conditioned to air conditioned and sit. And there was no exercise happening. Most of those guys had not exercised in 40 years.
Possibly.
Yeah. It was just living, that contrast was just like the advantage of just living on the side of a hill to your personal health.
They saw the 70-meter antenna dishes that they were building and they were inspired.
They just wanted to become that shape.
Yeah. No, my thought is I am unfortunately rapidly headed in that direction right now. So I've got to find a way to reverse course. Maybe I should move to the side of a hill. Well,
you can listen to our show on nude bodybuilding, and we'll all take it. We got to introduce you into that. Well, let's not call it a cult, really.
Sumo's the only member of this cult in our show.
No, we have lots of members, I'm sure, just dispersed around the country.
I'm just nude ordinarily, but I don't bodybuild wild nude. Right. That'd be weird.
I don't think anybody wants to see that.
That'd be.
Well, they don't want to see. What you do is you start in a phase that no one wants to see, and then you end in a phase where you're like a poster on some bar in San Francisco.
No, so that I was thinking about this recently, and I think there's something there because it's like at the times of my life when I least want to step on the scale is when I most need to face what it will tell me.
Right. See,
you know what I mean?
That's what's true about everything.
And it's like humiliating myself through nude bodybuilding might be the psychological whipping that I need.
Yes. Oh, you know what? We could still keep this anonymous and do this. So we could blur out your face and just have this as like a YouTube live stream.
I I don't know that I want to do that.
Well, you and Rocketman together.
I'm still not going to do that. I don't think Rocketman's interested in that either.
We could have, that I always like the new bodybuilding, the best music for it. Well, there's several good songs, but one of them is the Let's Get Physical. So imagine you and Rocketman together, just in a room, and you're lifting weights, but naked and sweaty, and it's let's get physical, physical. I want it, but your faces are blurred out. This is the future.
I'm not really.
What am I? Am I smearing my face with sorry, I'm bad with names.
Shoe polish.
Blackface. So something canceled from Facebook as well.
You're both doing shoe polish.
Okay.
Did you see that Japanese guy that?
You're really starting to sell this thing. I was skeptical at first, but now it just sounds really appealing. And
did you see that the Japanese guy doing blackface singing? They solved racism.
They did. They figured it out. The Japanese figured it out.
Well,
I mean, Japanese is, totally without any sort of diversity too. So I don't know that we can claim that as a victory.
No, they solved it.
Okay. Well, we'll cover that. We'll cover that in another show. Let's talk about the moon here before we go off in an even weirder direction.
Okay. All right.
Speaking of physics in the Japanese, I was in a classical electrodynamics class, and the professor, who was Japanese, had given us a homework assignment, and we spent like a week. All the students, we had this room where all the physics students went, called the I forget. Anyway, we tried everything. We tried punching it into our TI-89s. We tried looking it up in books. We tried doing it on the computer in Mathematica. Nothing. Nobody could find the answer to the stupid integral that we had to do for the homework assignment. So we get into class and we turn in the homework. Nothing happens. A week later, we come back and the professor's like, I am concerned. No one was able to. He had a great Japanese accent. Fantastic. I love the Japanese accent. He's like, concerned that no one was able to figure out integral. And he's like, it is very simple. And he picks up this book, and it's a table of integrals, and he flips to a page, and he's like, it is right here, table of integral. And the student in the front row is like, let me see that. And they grab the book, and they open it up, and they go, it's in Japanese. And someone else is like, so that's why they make better cars.
Yeah. Better
they've got math we don't have. And
Smokestack, do you have the Samurai Chatter clip available?
Yes, I do.
Let's play it. Does this sound like your professor at all? That is the sound of a Bigfoot, according to Bigfoot researchers, which is another show we're working on at the moment. But Bigfoots sound like angry Japanese samurai. They call it samurai chatter. They really do. And like they when people go out into the woods and they get these recordings and going, oh yeah, like that, and that's supposedly a Bigfoot. But or a Japanese aerospace teacher.
Well, I wonder how many people have encountered Bigfeets and thought they were just encountering like a weird samurai cult in the forest.
Oh, I'm sure it's in the hundreds of thousands.
I mean, total misidentification of all these phenomena out there, possibly.
Yeah. Well,
got to spread the word. You got to let people know.
I thought that maybe ghosts are just very, very slim, sort of demure Japanese women sneaking through a house.
Like,
I think that happens sometimes.
Geisha burglars.
Hmm?
Geisha burglars, like. They're burgling you?
Yeah, like geisha burglars. It all comes back to the Japanese when you want to get to even the Nation of Islam, their mother wheel UFO, Louis Farrakhan claims was built by one black scientist and a bunch of Japanese scientists. He calls them Nippon scientists to build the mother wheel of the Nation of Islam, which is a physical spacecraft that hovers around the moon. Most people don't know how weird the Nation of Islam is. It's all a UFO cult. It's Mormonism for black people. But anyway, why can you not see stars from the surface of the moon?
So it's not that you can't see stars from the surface of the moon. It's that you can't see stars from the surface of the Earth if your visual field is dominated by sunlight. When the sun gets bright, the iris in your eyes contract to reduce the amount of light that's coming into your eye. And that means that the dimmer things you can't see. My dad grew up on a farm, and for Thanksgiving every year we'd head back out to the farm, and it's so far away from the city, and there's no houses within like a half a mile. And so at night, if you're inside with the family and you're celebrating and drinking and the lights are all on, and you look out the windows, you can't see any stars. And when you go outside and you stand there for a few minutes, and it's on a beautiful clear night, no clouds in the sky, within a few minutes you are now able to see thousands of stars in the sky, and you feel like, wow, I can see them all. You can't actually see them all, but feels that way, and it's an amazing experience. So the same thing happens when you're in a spacecraft. If you're or on the surface of the moon, if your visual field is dominated by sunlight, then your eyes adjust, and you're not going to be able to make out the really dim things like stars. Even cell phone cameras. My doctoral dissertation was on star identification algorithms, and I thought, what would be really fun? Let's make an iPhone app that does the star identification. And I wrote all the code, and I put the thing in the app, and I went outside at night to test it, pointed it up at the sky, and found out literally it can't see any of them. So just because sometimes you can see the stars doesn't mean that all the time you can see the stars. The moon rotates at approximately. It takes about the same amount of time for the moon to make a revolution. What's the word? I've been programming for too long. It takes about the same amount of time for the moon to turn around as it does to go around the Earth, and that means that the day on the moon lasts about a month. And so they land. When they did the moon landings, they landed in lunar day. And that lunar day lasted for like 2 weeks. They didn't stay on the moon for 2 weeks, but that's how long it lasted. So the sun was up all the time that they were on the moon, because they didn't want to go. So their options were either we go when it's lunar night, where they would freeze to death, or lunar day when it's 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was easier for them to deal with the 200 degrees Fahrenheit than it was to deal with the cold. Also, if they were in the dark, they wouldn't have been able to see what they were doing. And even in the lunar day, they had trouble because without the atmosphere on the moon to diffuse the light, if you didn't get direct sunlight on something you were looking at, you couldn't see it because it was in shadow. And so there were situations where they'd have a thing and the lunar dust would get stuck on the inside, and they'd try to look into it and discover they can't see into it unless it's pointed directly at the sun.
But see, there's the thing. If it's without the atmosphere to diffuse the light, this is my problem then the light is not actually coming back at you. So if you just turn away from the sun is not filling up your vision, and it's not reflected back at you, so you should see all the stars.
But it is coming from the surface. Remember, the surface of the moon is like aluminum dust.
You just said you can't see what's in it unless you turn it and put it out of the sun.
Right. So if I'm an astronaut...
It seems like a contradiction of their story.
If I'm an astronaut, I'm looking down at something,
uh-huh.
Right? Then the reflected light from the surface of the moon is not coming up and then back into the thing to look in, right? So the sunlight's coming from this way, and I'm looking in here, and there's something down there. There's no light from the surface of the moon to reflect back in. So I can't see what's that way. I can maybe see the stuff on the inside of. Imagine this is a giant hole in it, and I'm looking into a surface, right? So I'd have to turn it and look like this for the sunlight to come in. Otherwise, I'd have to turn it upside down, and a lot of that stuff is not a good idea. It's too rickety. It's too lightweight. It's either too rickety for them to turn it upside down. It's too heavy for them to start picking up and maneuvering around. They had lots of weight on their backs. It's not a good idea to start messing. But they on the space station though, they go night to day every 89 minutes or so. As they go from the sun, as they go into the shadow of the Earth, which people call night. And so if they get in a spot with a window, lots of the space station doesn't have any windows. They have a special window just for gazing. And if you go in there and you turn out all the lights on the night side, you can see stars. And you can see stars from any of those spacecraft as long as you've got the lights turned out and you're in the shadow side. And it takes a few minutes, obviously, for your eyes to adjust. So depending on are you in night? Is there too much other light? That's what's going to determine whether you can see the stars or not, because they're very dim.
But they wouldn't be dimmer than they would be on Earth, though, would they?
No.
Right. So you should be able to, like, this is the thing, is that Buzz and them said, oh, we didn't see any stars the whole way to the moon, on the moon, or on the way back. Which seems like, I don't know. But sometime there you would, like, if you're on the moon and you just turn away from the sun and let your eyes adjust, you should see the stars, no?
Well, you're seeing the lunar environment. These guys were, keep in mind, these guys were so, they almost the entire time, right? Because they're far away from they're far away from the Earth. They're not in the shadow of the Earth. They get to the moon. They're not in any kind of shadow, and yeah. So I don't know. Was there a time when they could have seen some stars? Probably at some point during one little orbit for 15 minutes or so. Had they, bothered to look out the window while they were, flying around the backside of the Earth or something, maybe they would have seen it. I don't know the exact orbital parameters of before they did the lunar insertion burn, but that would have been their opportunity to be in night.
Okay, I gotta push this a little bit. So you're on the moon. You're in a position to observe the heavens from a perspective that no man has ever observed them before. And because there's no atmosphere, you would be able to achieve a great view of the stars, either from the spacecraft as it's traveling or from the surface of the moon. Now, why not just set up a tripod and a camera? I mean, they brought all kind of junk to the moon. Set up a tripod and a camera, aim it away from the sun, into the heavens somewhere. If there's no diffusion of light, because there's no atmosphere, shouldn't you have an almost totally black view and be able to adjust the exposure to see just an amazing view of the star field that nobody had ever seen before?
Well, first of all, when they weren't going to the moon to investigate the stars, that wasn't their goal. Their goal was to investigate the moon. Well, their goal was to make a public spectacle of the fact that they landed on the moon, and then they did a little science on the side. Second of all, when they got to the moon, they were so mesmerized by the Earth, they almost couldn't stop looking at the Earth. The first thing they do is as Buzz Aldrin describes it, is he gets at the moon and he looks around and he calls it magnificent devastation or desolation. Desolation, devastation, one of the two. There's an IMAX movie about it down in Florida where he narrates the whole thing. And the whole time he's just like, the Earth is amazing. The Earth is incredible. Look at that. And he's like standing on the freaking moon, second man to walk on the moon. And all I can do is stare at the Earth because it's so amazing. And he realizes how amazing it is because he's been to the moon. And third of all, yeah, a lot of scientists do want to put a telescope on the moon, on the backside of the moon. They want to put a radio telescope back there so that it doesn't get interference from any kind of radio broadcast from Earth. So there are scientists who would like to do that. I don't know that it's ever been done. I'm sure somebody was like, hey, let's point something in that direction and see if we get something. But that wasn't part of their goals, as far as I'm aware, for the moon missions.
So that's a real sort of human emotion based answer to the question that I actually found kind of compelling. It's like they were so wowed by, and also a lot of philosophical content there is that when you stand back off the Earth, off our home, and then you look back upon it from the desolation that is the rest of space, probably. It's amazing and overwhelming at how beautiful and special it is. I mean, that's kind of a nice thought.
Yeah, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. I'm still not sold that you can't see anything you can't see stars in space. That seems weird. But okay, moving on.
It's not like Star Trek. It's not like, oh, we're flying to the next planet, so cut to a shot of the ship and there's stars going all the way around. Like it's not like that. It's more like in Star Trek Generations, which was the first Star Trek movie they did with the cast from The Next Generation. And there's this scene in 10 Forward, which is the bar on the ship with these giant windows that look out the front. And the sunlight that's coming in the windows is overpowering everything. And you can't even tell the lights in the room are on. And people complained about it because they were like, why did it look like the sunlight was overpowering everything in the room and you couldn't tell that the lights were on? Well, if you're in a room during the day and you have direct sunlight coming into the room, that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, but
the sunlight overpowers the lights in the room.
But just just look the other way. That's the thing. Like, look out the other side, because the light, there's no diffuse anyway. Why? Okay, why? How did they survive? How did they deal with the radiation? So this is the thing that they bring up. They're like, well, how did they get they're like, my X-ray film doesn't go through a scanner at the airport, or my film doesn't go through an X-ray scanner at the airport without getting foggy, and yet they claim that both they took films and photos, they got them through the radiation environment of space, the Van Allen radiation belts, and it's such a high radiation environment that they sometimes will see flashes of light activated in their retina from the space environment, but also there's no physical issues from this.
Yeah, so first of all, there's lots of different kinds of radiation. Some radiation is charged particles. Cosmic rays are protons that are whizzing through you at nearly the speed of light. You've got neutron radiation. And then you've got high frequency electromagnetic radiation like gamma rays, X-rays, that sort of thing. Each different kind of radiation interacts with a different kind of thing in a different way. And different kinds of radiation have, depending on the kind of radiation and depending on the energy in that radiation, it will make it through a different amount of shielding. One of the biggest problems that they did face and didn't do much about was the radiation environment in space. They'd only discovered the Van Allen radiation belts in I think 58, 59, something like that. And they really didn't have a technology that would be what we would today consider an effective shield against radiation in terms of the humans being able to survive. Now, what they did have was enough shielding around things like film canisters to prevent X-rays from completely fogging up the images. If you go through an X-ray scanner at the airport and you have, it's like I've got a MacBook Pro, which is aluminum, and they're like, no, you got to take that out of the bag. We got to scan it by itself because it casts so much of an X-ray shadow and everything else that having it in the bag with everything else would obscure being able to tell what everything else is. Sure. And enough. I actually one time flying to an Apple developer conference, I had so many books in my backpack that they actually had to stop and remove the books because the paper in the books was blocking the X-rays. And that was when I stopped using paper books and started using ebooks. For everything except survival manuals. So, you can block that stuff. They just very intentionally try not to block X-rays going through the machine. They want the X-rays to go through everything. And depending on the ISO of your film, you're going to get film that is more sensitive to the X-rays or less sensitive. If you look at the handling of the film from the moon, it starts off in a metal box. Well, X-rays are blocked by heavier metals. That's why when you get an X-ray done, your bones appear white because they've blocked the X-rays from coming through, but your flesh doesn't do a good job of blocking it, so it comes through black or very dark gray. And then the film was transferred from inside the metal camera in a metal canister inside the metal camera into another metal canister, which was then inside another metal canister. So you've got a lot of layers of metal blocking the X-rays from coming through. So I wouldn't really expect, without having done the actual calculation, I wouldn't really expect them to knowing what X-rays were, and they had known what X-rays were for several decades. I would not have expected them to put X-ray sensitive film in an environment that they knew was not going to be shielded from X-rays without providing, a modicum of shielding that they were pretty sure wasn't going to mess up the images. They put a lot of work into those cameras. Kodak designed a special film just for the moon landing. They had to modify the mechanisms in the cameras. They had to remove greases, which would turn into a gas in the vacuum. So they did a lot of custom modifications to those cameras to make them work in a space environment.
Okay. So, but is it not true that the is it not true that the radiation that you'd experience in space is generally of a higher energy than what you'd see in, because there's you can have low energy X-rays or high energy X-rays, right? And the higher the energy, the more penetrative it's going to be.
The radiation environment in space is really bad. It is not. One of the reasons the International Space Station flies so low is to keep them under the Van Allen radiation belts. Now, the Van Allen radiation belts are actually charged particles that have been trapped by the Earth's magnetic field. And the Earth trapping those charged particles is one of the things that defends the surface of the Earth from the radiation in space. The other major things that defends us is the atmosphere. We actually, at first we thought, if we put stuff on Mars, the radiation is going to be just like in space because there's not a lot of atmosphere on Mars. But they did some measurements and they did some experiments, and it turned out that once you are below that tenuous atmosphere on Mars, there's actually enough atmosphere to block out enough radiation that it's not that big of a problem for electronics. It's nowhere near as bad as something like a geosynchronous satellite, which is like one of the worst radiation environments. So the Van Allen radiation belts trap charged particles, protons and electrons. And there's two belts. There's the proton belt and there's the electron belt. The proton belt is at a very low altitude, and the International Space Station flies the International Space Station is in this sort of like rough zone where they are barely high enough to maintain orbit, or else they're skimming the top of the atmosphere, and they're barely low enough to avoid the inner proton belt. In fact, over the South Atlantic Ocean, there's an anomaly where the Earth's magnetic field is a little weaker, and that causes the radiation belt to dip down to a little lower. And they have to take special precautions when last I heard, the rumor around the space community is they have to take special precautions when they're going through the South Atlantic anomaly, like hiding behind heavy equipment. I don't know if they're still doing that or if they finally found a way around it. But the truth is, something like a solar radiation event would have fried the astronauts. We're lucky that none of those happened on the way to the moon. When you're traveling to the moon, you're doing so on the order of a few days, and your mission plan is such that you can go every month. In contrast to Mars, where it takes you 8.5 months to get there, if something goes wrong, you can't go, well, we'll go next month. It's like you're done, you're there, and there's nothing to shield you if you didn't bring it with you. So if you were going to try to send people to Mars, you would be in a much, much worse spot for radiation. Now, some people have done some math. I was arguing with someone about this recently. They're like, well, we did some experiments on which parts of the body absorb the radiation and which parts care that they absorb the radiation. And, if we put some water here, right, if we put a bag of water right here, then that's good enough. And it's kind of like everybody's going to die. It's without running the numbers, it's like, come on, man, like this you're frying these people. And if you look at the kind of radiation dose that astronauts get serving on the space station for 6 months, it is orders of magnitude more than what would likely cause cancer. So it's not something I want to do. They even say, pilots and flight attendants on airplanes are, due to their altitude, are at an increased risk of radiation poisoning. But it's a thing where the dose makes the poison, and because you've been in the building, at that science lab there where the people who worked in certain compartments of the building had to wear dosimeters to measure their lifetime exposure to radiation.
Right. So here's a quote I have from Van Allen in his original paper describing the Van Allen radiation belts. All right, it was in Scientific American, March 1959. Quote: "Our measurements
it's got to be true.
It's got to be true. It's got to be. No, not scientific. This was a publication, not the mag. This was at the time like a journal, not the same as the modern science.
Rocketman is not impressed with your credentialism.
I'm just telling you a quote from. I was just citing the source. Anyway, our measurements show the maximum radiation level of as of 1958 is equivalent to 10 to 100 Roentgen per hour. Depending on the still undetermined proportion of protons to electrons, since a human being exposed for 2 days to even 10 Roentgens would have only a 50-50 chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight." Okay, so he's saying at low end you get 10 per hour, 10 Roentgen per hour, high end 100. So if the astronauts went through the Van Allen ratio, they claimed it only took 2 hours to go through in and out, so 4 hours total. That's between 40 and 400 Roentgen. right? Which is like, I think it's 0.4 to about 4 sieverts, basically. All right, well, then the lethal dose, according to is 4 sieverts. That's like a lethal dose of radiation just flying through. And they're the only time, the Apollo astronauts, if I'm not wrong, are the only astronauts who've ever sit supposedly through these belts to test it, right? So like, but it just seems a little bit, it's like they went through it and they had no problems. Not only did they not die, they had no problems.
Well, I don't know that it's correct to say that they had no problems. And frankly, off the top of my head, I don't remember who died from what. But
Buzz had anger problems.
Buzz had anger.
He punched
that one reporter or something?
Yeah, that's because of his radiation dose. But no, yeah. He's still alive despite being very old, despite flying through horrendous radiation. And like lethal dose, he's like, it's fine.
People were made of different stuff back then. It's the greatest generation, bro.
They were the right stuff. You can get through it. It's fine. Yeah.
They ate a lot of borax before they left.
It's bad, and that's without doing the math on the particular trajectory that they were on, and keeping in mind it was they were flying 10 years after Van Allen's original paper, that's so true. A lot more research. They had done more research on the radiation environment,
and it does change over time, depending on the sun output.
It does fluctuate depending on the space weather. Yes.
Yeah. The space weather.
In fact, that's. Well, never mind. I'll spare you the anecdotes to undergraduate research labs.
You should become our personal podcast space weatherman. Not a lot of people have space weathermen. Okay, so here's a big problem with the moon landing. All the videos look super fake.
And define looks super fake. I'm a software developer. Every little thing has to be spelled out in precise detail. Okay. What does look super fake mean?
Okay, well, when you look at them, you think, that's fake.
That's a, what the psychologists have taught me is that's what's called a judgment, not data.
Well, all data is, anyway. All right, so let's say if you take the moon landing footage and you play it at twice the speed, you're drinking Coke Zero again, even though you have dry eye. You got to drink water. Okay. All right. Rocketman. All right, good. Rocketman.
I got a water. Good man. Good
job. Okay. Now, okay. If you take the moon landing footage of the videos and you play it at twice speed, it looks like people just hopping around on a set because it looks totally normal. Like there's no weird gravity things happening, and it's like all you'd have to do is film this on a set and play it at half speed, and voila, you get your moon bouncing.
So I mean, if that's your first, so first of all, some things are going to happen more slowly, like the gravity pulling you back down, but that's an acceleration difference, not a linear difference in not a linear scaling of the velocity. And so I reviewed some of the footage,
which is why it's doubling it in a linear way shouldn't make it look normal.
It doesn't look normal. It does. To someone who's skilled in kinesiology, there are subtle differences. It just what one person says looks normal is kind of like I see the episodes of the Munsters from the 50s or the 60s, and they do the scenes where they speed things up, and it's supposed to look like something happened fast, or really it just looks like they sped it up. Like that, some people saw that and thought, oh, it looks like they're doing it fast. Like, no, they just accelerated the footage. So that there's subtle differences. And I did review some of the footage you sent me, and I didn't bother making any precise measurements because it comes down to, well, I looked at it and I kind of thought it was like this instead of being able to actually measure.
All we have because no one goes to the moon anymore because it's too hard. Because in the 60s,
it is hard. It's really hard.
But in the 69, it was easy, and now it's too difficult, and we destroyed all the technology. They did it in less than 10 years.
Why would you want to go?
What do you mean, why would you want to go? Of course you want to go to the moon. The moon would be amazing.
Why would you want to give up everybody's life so that you could afford to go?
What do you mean? What does that mean?
The expense, the cost of going to the moon.
Just print the money. That's it. It's just they just That's all it is. But look, the economic issues aside, of course you want to go. That's like saying, why do you want to go
You can't
to the
print
new
money. You
world?
can only print currency.
Why do you want to go to the new world? Because the new world is cool.
Well, the new world is habitable, for one.
Well, that's true, but we could.
That's the big one right there. Is it's habitable. People are like, not going to Mars. That's like saying the explorers wouldn't come to New York. And I'm like, well, New York had water and air and trees and grass and food. And,
But you gotta take the baby steps of going to a local place. It's like saying, I don't want to go to the 7-Eleven down the street because it's boring, but I'm going to take a flight to Madrid. If you want to get to another nice place in the solar system, assuming there is one, you have to first learn to go to these other spots.
No, it's like saying, I'm going to send gangs of thugs to threaten my neighbors to fund my going to Madrid. That's what it's like.
Which is totally something countries do.
Okay,
threatening
that's
people
right.
for
All
money at gunpoint is like government 101.
Let's back up and let me ask Rocketman a more philosophical question here. Should man further explore the solar system, and what should be the goal?
I don't think that's a should question.
Okay.
I don't believe. Should is about two things: moral imperatives and whether or not a strategy achieves the desired goal. And so that's what should is about. If you have lots of opulent money left over from your prosperity and you want to fund exploration of the solar system, I got no problem with it. I'd love for you to hire me. But it's not the sort of thing where you ought to be threatening to take down someone's business because they didn't give you money to go do that. Like that's just morally inappropriate. And that's what we've got in NASA.
So you don't have to. You don't have to threaten any business owners to go to space. You can they didn't do that.
Yeah, well, the collection of the taxes that required to fund the program.
But you gotta do that. They do that anyway. If you're gonna do that, then use it for something cool. Like, okay, here's the big, like, people are like, why would you want to go to the moon? And another country would want to go to the moon just to be like, oh, we can also go to the moon. We're big dogs too. Like, if China and Russia just gonna let America have the claim of being the moon only.
I think you guys are gonna have to cut your video feeds. I'm getting a lot of garble.
There.
Yeah, can you guys cut your video? Or at least
my video. I think
Sumo,
my video cut.
Sumo, cut your video.
I'm gonna cut my video.
Okay.
Am I better? Okay. So here's the thing. Like, why? Of course, other countries would want to go to the moon because we went to the moon. It's like the whole argument that it isn't. Like, why would you want to go? Like, they had a race to see who could get to the South Pole. You can't inhabit the South Pole. And everyone was like, all the countries were like, well, we got to go to the South Pole too to prove that we're cool and we're technologically capable, and not just let whoever got to the South Pole first. I think was the Dutch got to the South Pole first. I don't remember. But anyway, it's the same thing. It's like, why? Of course you'd want to go to the moon.
Well, this is the this is I believe the phrase is, behold the magnificent works of the state. And this is the government trying to puff itself up in how proud they are and in how many people they control and how much wealth they can take. And they phrase it as, oh, look at what our country can do. But the country can't do anything. Only the people in the country can do stuff. And they're just taking the resources away from the people, away from stuff. It's like I was at a conference and was visiting Mount St. Helens, and as part of my vacation for the conference, and I stopped in a gas station, and I can't remember whether it was Oregon or Washington, and I started pumping the gas, and this guy comes over to me and he's like, "Oh, I have to do that," and I'm like, "No," and he's like, "No, it's a law in this state that I have to pump the gas. You can't pump your own gas." And I'm like, how gullible do you think I am? And he's like, no, really, that's the law. And I'm like, look, if you don't get away from me, I'm going to report you to the gas station owner. And he's like, and he walks away, and I go in. And so I say to the clerk, I'm like, hey, there's this guy lurking over here telling me he has to pump my gas. And they're like, well, that's the law. And I'm like, oh my gosh, you people are crazy. And I go back out to the car and the guy's like, so what did the clerk tell you? And I'm like, they said you were right. It's the law. And he says, yeah. And I'm like, but you shouldn't be doing that. And he's like, well, if I didn't do this, I wouldn't have a job. And I said, no, you'd have a job doing something I wanted, right? Instead of a job doing something I don't want. Well, and that's the definition of economy, that people are doing the jobs that other people want done instead of the jobs that the leaders of the gangs of thugs tell them they want done.
You should have said, I was right. He told me you're fired. That's how you go. Look, but okay. But that's neither here nor there. Like, just on a matter of like national warring pride, if the U.S. made it to the moon, then the USSR is not going to be like, just for propaganda purposes. They're not going to be like, oh, the capitalists made it to the moon, but we can't. Of course they would go to the moon and be like, and we went better to the moon.
Well, like, I think that's the point, is like, I think I'd feel better about space travel if people would quit telling me it's for science.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not interested in sacrificing my paycheck to your weird science god. But if you just want to do something awesome, some giant civic works demonstration that is going to maybe give us some sense of unity and shared culture and achievement as a people, I think that's more valuable than #science that you get going to the moon.
Yeah,
but that's
like
just me.
Putting mirrors on the moon for laser reflectors.
Right.
Because we have to measure where the moon is, because we don't know where it is, because we had to guess when we landed on it. It's
Rocketman, what do you think of Elon Musk's notion of turning man into an interplanetary species?
You know, part of the reason I got into aerospace engineering was because I did want to be an engineer for manned flights. It just so happened that the advisors that I got at the schools that I went to and the projects I was on, I was doing a lot more work in autonomous flight, and ended up doing sort of like computer algorithms for aerospace, which the aerospace department was like, oh, that's computer science. And the computer science department was like, oh, that's aerospace. So there was like this giant field where nobody had done any research in a long time. And it was easy for me to swoop in. And like I'm in a class and they're just like, oh, here's this problem. And 12 seconds later, I had a solution. And that was my dissertation. What was the question?
What do you...
I'll just start telling you stories.
No. Wait. What do you think of Elon Musk's notion that man should be an interplanetary species and we're going to achieve that by going to Mars?
I don't know about should. You know, if he wants to make a product case that, hey, here's this great product, or here's this great experience, or, you know, here's a subdivision housing that I've opened up in a fantastic environment, he's free to make that case. My only concerns, you know, from a public moral standpoint are, you know, is he just really putting people in a death trap? Like, is there an answer to the radiation problem? Is the stuff reliable enough that they're going to be able to survive? You know, 300 years ago, we didn't have the same kind of attitude about people offering products that would just get you killed that we have nowadays. Nowadays, they're funded by the government, and you know, 1/6 of the population is being wiped out by products that get people killed. But you know, if it's safe, what's the problem with him offering it as a commercial product? There's no problem with that. I don't think that it's a moral imperative. I don't think that it's a strategic imperative. And I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, which means they're going to be living in sort of this hodgepodge of highly advanced technology and utter poverty. They're going to be working their butts off, and they're going to have teams of people on the earth working their butts off to provide their basic necessities that they'd be able to provide for themselves if they were on Earth. So it doesn't seem like a great idea to me.
This is like, in my mind, if we're going to do this, if this is even possible, okay, we should just treat it like when we were trying to sell to America and just be like, well, hop on there. Some of you are going to die, but Godspeed.
Well, I think you're all going to die because it's not habitable.
So we got separate ships going. There's more than one mission in my imagination. And it's like some of you are going to crash. Some of you are going to get fried by the sun. Some of you are going to starve to death when you get there. But like 1 out of 100 is going to make it. And that's how we're going to do this.
Make it.
And that's the guy's name that we're going to write down and tell everyone.
Right. And that's the attitude you should have when you're doing space travel. is just like, well, there has to be some blood on this altar here. Some of you are sacrificial lambs in the name of getting there.
Now you're at it. This is what I think old Musk and the whole transplanetary species bogus teleology is about. It's going to be a live, televised, drawn-out human sacrifice ritual. We're gonna send people to Mars. We're gonna televise every inch of their horrible deaths. And we're all going to participate in this human sacrifice ritual. That's what's going on.
This is where I think maybe we just hit on why we have this disagreement. Is because to me, in my mind, the moon landing is less believable because people didn't die. And if you should go into space for no real reason other than the growth of the human spirit. And you should get to other planets for that reason, and also that some or even great amounts of death are an acceptable trade-off for trying to get there.
Wait.
I mean, define didn't die. Many people died in the American rocket program before the moon landing.
In the Apollo program. In the Apollo program.
Yeah, in the Apollo program, several people died.
No, on the moon missions. The moon, okay. On the
what do you mean the moon missions? The entire decade, everything was aimed at trying to go to
the moon. Not the ones that were prep work for the moon.
You're saying the ones who were successful at getting to the moon didn't die on the way back.
11 to 17.
So 13 famously almost died many times.
No, but via some magic movie tricks. They're like, oh, we have this highly technical thing, and then it's all planned out. But then, if something goes wrong, you can just sort of ad hoc jury rig it and fly it back.
Well, go ask Ken Mattingly. He was an Auburn graduate. He was the president of the student body at Auburn. He was slated to be on Apollo 13. Was misdiagnosed with a disease shortly before launch. He was replaced. He was on the ground and he was supporting these guys coming up with, go ask him. So was it real? Was he really coming up with things to save people's life, or was it a show?
Well, see, it's convenient that he didn't actually get to go. Now, I was going to go.
I think he later went. He flew on a later mission, I thought.
He did not. Wait a minute. What's this guy's name?
Ken Mattingly?
Ken Mattingly. Because if he went to the moon, he'll be on a Wikipedia page. Mattingly. All right. He does have a Wikipedia page. And he's in a spacesuit. Did he go to the moon? He was Apollo 16.
Yeah.
Yeah, he didn't go to the moon. He's a liar. All right, let's get Ken Mattingly on this show.
Okay.
How old is he now? Is he still alive?
I don't know. These guys are all pretty old now.
I'm sure he would love to come on the show and be badgered by you.
This is the thing. I'm not afraid of him punching me because he's 84 now. So if I go up to him like that guy did to Buzz Aldrin and say, "You're a liar," and he tries to punch me, I'm like, that's a slow 84-man punch. It's fine. So, but let's see. All right, Apollo 16. I'm looking at the picture right now, and it looks fake. That's all I'm saying. Okay. All right. So Ken Mattingly.
And how do you feel about that?
Me? What?
And how do you feel about that? Sorry, I'm slipping into, psychological facilitation there because it's, you say, it looks fake. What's the data behind that?
Part of your evidence is these photographs, and it's sort of like, maybe, but also, it's like Elon Musk recently when he sent his car up into space, he said on TV, he said, you can tell it's real because how fake it looks. I was like, that's not. That's not. Anyway, so Ken Mattingly is a liar. We've all proven it. No, Ken, I know you're listening. I know he's a big fan. I'm not attacking you here. I'm just saying perhaps you were part of a conspiracy. I don't know. But so that would be good. We should have him on and be like, hey, all right, this is the new thing. We got to get Ken Mattingly on the show. We got to get Ken Mattingly on the show to talk about his time on the moon. But
more seriously, the stuff, the going to the moon was absolutely, the edge of technologically what was possible. It was something they imagined. It took them 10 years, nearly 10 years to actually achieve being able to do it. But it was on the edge of what was technologically possible. If you want to claim that it didn't happen, what's your motivation behind that? It's going to be more psychological. It's going to be more philosophical than it is data, because nobody has any data that proves that it didn't happen.
Well, that's because you're trying to prove a negative. You can never. It's like, this is my thing about the stars. It's because like that would be a provable thing. Like if he got up there and he was like, I saw this star, then that would be a falsifiable position, because you could look back in the astronomical calendar and be like, well, what stars would have been visible to him at that moment? Did he say the right one? And if he said one that couldn't possibly have been seen, then you give it a falsifiability. But they never.
But instead, what we have is photographs from the surface of the moon that show, patches of light and dark on the moon in a particular pattern. And then decades later, another country sends a satellite to the moon to take high-resolution photographs of the surface, and their data reflects patches of light and dark that's in the same pattern as the photographs from the surface.
Satellite around the moon. Are you talking about the satellite?
The Japanese did a satellite.
Yeah, and it was the crappiest.
A couple of countries now.
Yeah. And there are always these, when they go over the Apollo site, it's like you can zoom in on the satellites of Earth to like a house and see the color of the painting of the sighting. But on this one, it's like, there's a dot of that dot is the lander. It's like,
I was expecting better photos of the landing stuff.
And of course, yeah. So, okay. But anyway, leave that. I know people are like, well, it's just psychological. But what I'm saying is there's no other. So you present these photos, which, let's be honest, you could fake the photographs. You could make a stage. Hollywood does this stuff all the time. And you could fake the photographs. Okay, but things that are falsifiable, like where's the telemetry data? It got taped over, quote unquote. Where's the original footage? It got lost and taped over, quote unquote. Which stars did you see? I don't know.
Define original and footage. So the original transmission from the moon was coming back in a format that wasn't, the TV broadcast from the moon was in a format that wasn't directly compatible with the nation's television industry. So they had to have a converter, because they couldn't transmit that high data rate. They had to go with a frame every 10 frames a second instead of 29.997 frames per second.
Okay.
They had to go with many fewer scan lines on the screen in order to achieve the transmission, because they had they had a giant dish on the Earth receiving that. It was the best they could do, and then in order to convert that into something that you could see on your television screen, they had to have several technologies linked together, which included a standard television camera pointed at the screen, and the screen was rendering like this other stuff. And so what got recorded over was not the converted footage that was compatible with our television infrastructure. What got recorded over were the original, it's called slow scan TV. What got recorded over were the slow scan TV recordings. And they got recorded over at a time when magnetic tape was at a premium and suppliers were failing to deliver quality tape, at a time when the demands on the information recording were drastically increased due to the new Landsat satellites in like 1981, where you had these satellites going up recording, as you say, unprecedented levels of details of imagery of the surface of the Earth, and they had to record all that data. And so they needed high quality magnetic tape to record it on, and their suppliers were failing. And so
but they don't tape over the moon landing.
But they had converted.
It's like none of this is justification for taping over the original film of a guy landing on the moon.
I wouldn't want to have been the bureaucrat who decided to do that, but think about his decision from a
if they decided to. The story I've heard is they accidentally did. They were just so negligent. They were like, I don't know, what's that old film? Should we bother to look at what's on it first? No. Let's just tape over. If you're saying, here's a case marked moon landing, and they're like, just tape over it. Well,
keep in mind, These are government bureaucrats. It's not like they had a box marked moon landing. They made up some sort of like, oh, this is box A5CPD3-201, and they're like, well, what's that? Well, we don't know. Well, can you read anything that's on here? No, we put it in a tape player and it didn't work. All right, well, we'll use that.
These are the same people supposedly confident enough to go to the moon 6 times.
Whoa. That's actually if they would have just put it on a regular old machine and tried to read it, it would have not shown anything because the format was all wonk. So they would have said,
there was a special lab at Goddard Space Flight Center that had a machine that was capable of interpreting the information on the tapes. I don't know why they ended up deciding to do that. I can tell you what the report said from the people who tried to research it. Some of the people who made that decision were dead at the time they tried to find it. And at the time they recorded over it, there was no other. Nowadays we run all our videos through computers. We edit everything on computers. We convert everything on computers. I've done that. I've been a video director for my church Sunday school. But in '81, they didn't have that technology. They would have had, it still would have been an analog conversion, and they did not have the high resolution, public media consumption that we have now that would have caused them to say, oh, well, maybe we're going to convert this to another format that's higher quality. They had already done the highest quality conversion that they had any expectation that they would have been able to do. So I don't know that it would have been in their minds like we're deleting the moon footage. They already had the moon footage, and we still have the moon footage, just in a different format, and unfortunately slightly lower quality than what we might have been able to get out of the slow scan TV record.
Unfortunately, all the mistakes just make it so that it's harder to test if it actually happened.
So
this is the thing. It's like
I got a question. So they were transmitting live from the moon landing, and that's what we have. That's the recordings we have. Why didn't they record film and then bring it back so we could have a better video after the fact?
Some of it they did. There were some in terms of photographs they did. Some of the video on board the command module, which didn't have, so that the lunar module would be stationary on the moon, and it was easier for them to point their high gain antenna at the right position on Earth from the command module, which was always in orbit. After launch and before landing on Earth, it was always in orbit. It's flying around all the time. It would have been harder for them to maintain a steady pointing of a high gain antenna. My understanding is that there was some video taken on board that module, which they did later broadcast. But it was recorded and then brought down and broadcast. And of course, the photographs that you see that you complained weren't fogged up with X-rays, those were also things that they recorded on the moon and then brought back. And those are incredibly high resolution, even compared to like our cell phone cameras nowadays. Like film
has better resolution than digital, even now, if I'm not mistaken. In most every case.
That's why we have Star Trek: The Next Generation on Blu-ray, and we'll never get Deep Space Nine on Blu-ray, and we'll never get Voyager on Blu-ray because they were done digitally, whereas The Next Generation was done on film. And so we're gonna have super high res Next Generation, and so now you get to go back and you get to see every time the side of the camera was slightly off the edge of the set, and you can see backstage over there on one side, and you can see the mic, you can see the boom mic mounted in the top of the turbo lift when they walk in the door, because the edges of modern production are different than what the edges in TV were back then. On TV there was a part of the image that you expect to get cut off, and you get to see all those accidents.
Yeah. Film is still, except for I think the extremely experimental high resolution digital cameras, film has better resolution. But anyway, okay, all right. So we've established that the pictures look fake, but they just look. There's the ones. What about the ones when they're the film and they're hopping around and it clearly looks like a wire is above them? That looks just weird. What is that?
Show me that particular photograph, and
no, it's those videos. It's those okay.
Videos.
All right, why
the black and white videos in exceptionally low resolution, recorded at one, third the normal video rate.
No. The high res, the quote unquote good ones. But anyway. It's just everyone. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, YouTube or BitChute, because they often pull it down from YouTube because they don't like the truth. But astronauts on wires, and just look at it, and it looks like astronauts on wires. Anyway, that's all.
How is that like your life?
What do you mean? How's that like my life?
That's what the psychologist asked. That's the next step. You say something.
No.
Psychology says, and how is that like your life? We're looking for patterns. We're looking for emotional transference. Have you been in a situation where people deceived you, and are you transferring that situation onto NASA? I think NASA is doing a lot of things that are wrong. You're deceiving me
right now. You're like a little puppet on a string over here for NASA, just dancing around, and I'm like, oh, here's another man on the string.
There's something NASA has done which have, in my opinion, been a deception, at least in terms of their explanation for how important it is. But the actual moon landing itself is not one of the deceptions.
Okay. Why wasn't there any blast crater when the lander came down? Why was there no dust?
Define blast. Define blast.
Okay, so you've got a rocket coming down on the lunar regolith, which is presumably loose enough that footprints can be made on it. But yet, when the rocket lands on it and then they take photos afterwards, there's like no disturbance in the dust around it.
So the descent engine on the lunar module, I looked this up, is about 6 feet in diameter. The nozzle of the engine is about 6 feet in diameter. Right. The rated thrust for that engine goes up as high as a little over 10,000 pounds. And if you look at it was throttleable, so they could, power it up and down. And if you look at the amount of power that they would have been using at landing, it was a little over 3,000 pounds of thrust.
Which is more than an astronaut's boot, by the way.
It's about the same amount as like a medium to heavy car. My car is a little, because I got a cheap Honda, it's a little lighter weight than that. A big SUV is a little heavier than that. But a car's weight is going to be distributed over an area of about 100 square inches. And if you were to drive out into the desert, you would leave, an impression, but you're talking about 3,000 pounds over 100 square inches. Well, the nozzle on the descent engine was 6 feet in diameter, which is a little over 4,000 square inches. And so you've got a little over 3,000 pounds in a little over 4,000 square inches. You're looking at a little under, on average, a little under a pound per square inch of force. Now, if you take a standard household vacuum cleaner, you're looking at a pressure differential of somewhere between 2 to 3 pounds per square inch. And that vacuum cleaner is only effective on dust when you're less than an inch away from it. Whereas that landing engine nozzle was more than a foot off of the surface of the moon. Furthermore, you can actually see some slight amounts of dust being blown away from the landing site in the video of the thing touching down. They're sort of wispy, but you can actually see some streams of dust. So you're talking about a very low pressure system. You can't be like, this is because here's what happens. All right, so people bring up these issues, and then over the years, they come up with various numbers to make it seem like to obfuscate the thing. They're like, here's all these numbers and blah blah blah. You can't. It doesn't make any sense to be like, well, when we walked on it with our moon boots, when we all weighed 1/6 the weight we do now, we left these big, very defined, very Bigfoot-like footprints that are perfect, and you can see all the ridges. That's how loose this rock is with our very lightweight hopping bodies. But yet, when the spaceship lands on it, nothing. It just sort of... Well, a 6 foot wide nozzle, the blast would have been spread out over a larger area. It's not like there's a hole. When you've got an astronaut in a boot, they're a couple hundred pounds, because you've got a much of the space.
No, they're not, because there's 1/6 gravity.
Hold on. I'm going to factor that into the equation. Okay. So the starting weight on Earth with the spacesuit on is a few hundred pounds, because the spacesuit's actually very, very heavy. Right. Then divide by 1/6. So you're talking about so you're talking about 50 pounds. You've got about maybe 25 square inches. So you're at double. The boot is at double the pressure into the dust. And here's the other kicker: the differential in the pressure between what's directly under the boot and what's slightly off to one side is very large. And that's why you can tell where the boot print is, because the dust grains that are pushed out of the way by the boot going in are right here. sorry, you can't see in the video anymore, but they're, a quarter of an inch away from the ones that aren't. And that sharpness and the contrast of the material and the angle of the light is what allows you to see the boot print. Whereas you've got the 6-foot nozzle.
It should let you see the print of this is their problem.
No, you've got the pressure differential spread out over, a 6-foot wide area at start, and it's going to expand after that because the gas the exhaust gases are going to push away from each other. Look, so they're blowing out to the side, and the dust on the moon is not very thick.
You said it was throttle.
Now, Rocketman, let me try to bring this into my layman's understanding here. So, because the lunar atmosphere is so low pressure, is a factor here that the exhaust gases from the motor would dissipate and drop to a very low pressure very quickly in a small space under the nozzle, and because they're entering such a low pressure environment as compared to, say, Earth atmosphere?
There's two things going on. First of all, because you don't have an atmosphere and because you have very low gravity, you can land with a thruster that's not very powerful compared to, say, the engines that lifted off the Saturn V. So you're talking about a low-powered engine. You're talking about a low-pressure engine, and so you don't have to push much out the bottom of that nozzle. Well, I say much. Compared to like the space shuttle, it's not much. And in addition to that, the gases would have been expanding out to the side more than they would have on Earth because there's a lack of, more. You would have gotten the gas doesn't just come straight out of the nozzle. The exhaust gases are going to tend to expand in width as well. If you look at a video of a rocket launching today, you'll see the same effect. If you zoom in on the rocket and it fills most of your frame, you're going to see very high, very bright exhaust gases that are luminous coming out the back. But if you zoom out a little bit, the exhaust plume, the width of the exhaust plume is going to dominate the width of the rocket. It's going to be much, much wider. And most of what you see in a rocket launch, if you're there for it, you see a tiny little tip that's glowing, and then you see a giant wide exhaust plume as trailing behind the rocket. If you're on the moon, where your engine exhaust is nowhere near as powerful, and you also don't have as much atmosphere to the sides to push the gases back in, you're going to see a blooming coming out the bottom of the thruster, and that's going to spread the force out over a larger area. It's going to be very continuous in that area, and so you're not going to have well-defined edges of where stuff was blown away and where it wasn't, like you would with a boot print, where all of the pressure is exactly in one tiny little area, and nothing's sort of blowing things out to the side. And so as you watch that video, the lunar lander coming down, you watch the video out the window there, you can see streams of dust, wispy streams of dust being blown away from the landing site. But it's only in the last I think 3 to 8 seconds or something like that. Only the last few seconds so they get close enough for those rapidly dispersing exhaust gases to actually disturb the dust. And the dust on the moon, because it hasn't been weathered, tends to stick together a lot more than it does on Earth. We've got a lot of very weathered dust down here that's got, if you look at the microscopic particles, that's very round, whereas moon dust tends to be very craggy, and that allows it to stick together better than the dust on Earth.
Okay, I think that was so what you're saying is the same thruster in a lower pressure environment is going to have a more fat cardioid pattern to the plume, whereas in a higher pressure atmosphere you get that more classic pencil shape blowtorch pattern that's longer and extends further down.
And that's and when you look at the differences in thrusters that are designed to function in the atmosphere, like a first stage on a rocket versus the engines that are built to work in space, like the third stage or something, you're going to see on those later stages, you're going to see a nozzle that comes to look at the angle of the nozzle that it makes at the end, and towards the ground you're going to see a sharper angle on the nozzle that's for a vacuum. You're going to see that nozzle continue on around more, and that makes them more efficient because it's able to direct more of the gas in the direction you want it to go, whereas on Earth so there's two things going on that compete with each other. One is the drag of the exhaust gases against the nozzle itself. And you don't want drag against the nozzle because it reduces the amount of thrust that you have. The second is are the gases actually expanding in the direction you want them to go? Because if they're going in the wrong direction, you're losing that in thrust. And so the pressure of the atmosphere that you're in on Earth keeps those gases in more and keeps them directed better. And so you can cut your nozzle off earlier and reduce the drag on the nozzle. Whereas when you're in a vacuum, you don't have that external pressure keeping your exhaust stream together. You need a nozzle that's longer to direct the thrust more. So they're slightly different. You might not notice it if you weren't looking for it, but there are, the we call it the trade-off in the business. It's the trade-off between the one thing and the other, and the one thing is drag on the nozzle, and the other is direction of the thrust. So you're trading in the different environments. So yeah, when you're in that vacuum environment, you're going to get more of, I don't think it's the right word, but the cardioid pattern. Sure, I think I know what you mean. It's going to sort of billow out more.
Okay, so following on with a second question. So at the time that this was done, it seems to me that this controlled thruster-based landing, as opposed to a glide landing, was pretty unique technology and pretty cutting edge. Where you've got the main thruster and then you have some stabilizing thrusters. Am I describing basically what the lander, how it worked? You have one main thruster providing most of the lift, and then some stabilizers to keep it angled correctly?
I know that they did have some maneuvering thrusters. I don't know whether they used them on landing. I do know that the descent engine could be gimbaled, which was a very difficult system to operate. And they had built sort of real thruster gimbal landing craft on Earth for them to practice using, and they didn't always succeed. And one of the reasons that they picked Neil Armstrong to do the landing was because in a test on Earth, in one of these, rocket-powered hovercraft, something had gone horribly wrong, and it began to flip. And it flipped in such a way that it was completely unrecoverable. And just at the moment where it sort of makes the transition to the astronaut being on top to the astronaut sort of being on the side because the thing was tipping and becoming uncontrollable, Neil Armstrong decided to abort the test. And he hit the button and his ejection seat took him away, and that landing test craft crashed and exploded, but he was taken away. And one of the reasons they picked him was because he had the foresight to be able to say, we're not going to make it, we need to abort this. And that was,
well, that wouldn't have worked on the moon, though.
That wouldn't work on the moon. And why would you pick the guy that just crashed the thing?
You pick the guy who...
He escaped the crash.
He demonstrated good instinctual decision making while piloting a
aircraft.
Pretty unpredictable craft. Well, I guess my question about that was,
you could have done that on the moon. Remember, the ascent engine was not the same as the descent engine. The lunar excursion module had two halves. Right, it had bottom half and the top half. And the top half was the part the astronauts were in and the part that ascended from the moon. The bottom half was mainly the descent and landing equipment, and they abandoned that on the moon. And so the ascent engine is connected to the top half, and it actually uses the bottom half as like a launch pad. So they did have the ability, as far as I know, they did have the ability to abort the landing if they ran out of fuel, and they could have returned to orbit. And they wanted someone who was going to be able to not kill themselves while crashing into the moon.
I mean,
as to your point about how come none of these people died, it's because they picked the guy who in the testing saved himself instead of landing.
Well, I would crash the thing.
If they hang on, Sumo. So they went and they took this incredibly hard craft to fly, and they made it work on the moon several times. And then we didn't use that sort of flight technology again for a really long time, it seems. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think we went kind of back to a winged, if we were able to land things vertically and make them...
the transition from the Apollo hardware to the space shuttle hardware.
Yeah.
Like the design change.
Yeah, and I understand we wanted to reuse it. Yeah. Well, like, it was supposedly going to be cheaper, and I think they were able to get a lot more...
That's what the politician thought.
Gear. Weren't we able to get a lot more gear into orbit with the space shuttle than with a the Apollo format?
Yeah, one of the things that they didn't like about the Saturn V, the Apollo spacecraft, the only piece of that equipment that you get back is the command module, and it's damaged. Excuse me, it's damaged to a point where you really can't reuse it.
Okay.
After it comes through, the heat shield's burned off mostly burned up on the way in through the atmosphere. It lands in the ocean. The Apollo 11 command module sits in the National Air and Space Museum, which is one of my favorite museums to go to and see this stuff. Also, the actual Starship Enterprise is at the Air and Space Museum. It was in the gift shop. They finally put it in here's stuff from entertainment. But the majority of that equipment, very expensive to build, very difficult to build. Every bit in the digital computers in the Saturn V had to be hand wired by women sitting around, wiring stuff through tiny little iron, microscopic iron rings by hand. And it was just burned up, thrown away. And they wanted a spacecraft that would be more reusable. And that was one of the motivations for the space shuttle program. And that's why they called it the shuttle, because it was supposed to go back and forth and back and forth. So they ended up, there were a lot of competing design requirements for the space shuttle. And the design was selected by a politician, not an engineer. And it had lots of problems. It functioned like a rocket sometimes and an airplane in others, and sort of maybe did them all at the wrong times. Certainly, Scaled Composites and Virgin Galactic would say, well, maybe you want to take off like an airplane instead of landing like an airplane, and then you land like a glider instead of like a real airplane. And I was there the day Scaled Composites did their first Spaceship One launch in Mojave. I was interning at JPL at the time, and we got word on a Friday afternoon, oh, hey, Monday, our advisor came in. He was like, I may not check in with y'all on Monday. And I didn't know what was going on, but some of the other kids were like, all right, we're going to the Spaceship One launch. But yeah, so they wanted something that was reusable in the space shuttle. They wanted something that had a lot higher lift capability. The Air Force wanted to be able to deploy spy satellites. One of the orbiters was outfitted with, Air Force encryption equipment. That was the Discovery. Had a lot of top secret stuff on there. I don't know all what. I just know that it did. And whenever they flew secret missions, it was on Discovery. So yes, those were some of the motivations for the space shuttle program. Any other questions about the space shuttle program?
No. Why did we abandon this technique of vertical takeoff and landing and not use it again for a long time if it works so well going to the moon?
They still did vertical takeoff. They just didn't do vertical landing. They thought that by using a glider, part of the original idea was, you land in any airport, and
right.
you don't have to fly ships out to the sea to catch these guys. You have a pinpoint landing. You know exactly where they're going to be. And the reality became the thing was so big and it had so little power by the time it landed that you needed a runway that was so long just for the thing to slow down that you couldn't land it at any airport. You had to build specialty airports for it.
Right.
And so you only had a couple of airports throughout the world where the runways were big enough, and they were like, well, we need one in California. And it's kind of like, where are we going to get a highway this, where are we going to get a runway this big in California? And it's like, well, we have a giant desert out here. How about we just pretend that's a runway? So that's White Sands. So they thought that it was going to be a better idea. And the reality was it created problems, and they didn't understand how big the problems they created were going to be until they started going wrong. Okay. And frankly, up until the Space Shuttle Columbia disaster, I don't think they understood how big a risk the wing leading edges were on that vehicle. And even after it had launched, they did an analysis and were like, no, this can't be destroyed. And then it did. And it took them months, nearly a year, to be able to replicate the failure, because it was such a freak accident that even if they did understand most of how it could go wrong, but there was freak ways where if you hit it just right, at just the right angle, in just the right place, you'd get a microscopic fracture you'd never be able to see, and it wouldn't matter until you tried to land. And that fracture in the heat shield on the wing leading edge would let in enough heat, let in enough plasma to to whatever happened next. We're not real sure what happened, but it did break up.
Okay. So I guess the answer to my question is, It was the vertical landing technology was great. It was a stupid idea to abandon it with the space shuttle, but now we're returning to it with the SpaceX era of craft.
You know, they're looking at the potential failure modes, and they're saying, you know, this frustum, this conical frustum, is an easier shape to manage. You don't have to go through the complexity or the added weight of the wings. You not only land with the wings, you have to launch the wings.
Yeah.
So there, you know, everybody's looking at it and going, you know, this just makes more sense. If stuff falls off the rocket, like the Space Shuttle Columbia was hit by either foam or ice, I don't remember, from the side of the external tank. I think it was foam. Foam. By putting the conical frustum on top of the rocket, it doesn't get hit by things falling off the rocket. So you're just, you know, you're doing an error modes analysis and going, hey, let's pick the design that doesn't have the kinds of failures that we've seen are catastrophic in the past.
Okay. Right. Let's move on from the landing specifications. Okay, what about the other great one, the other classic moon truther thing of the shadows on the moon are at weird angles?
I mean, I've seen some people and they're like, oh, look at this photo and this shadow goes this way and that one goes the other. And in order to, you know, what I look for as someone trained in science and engineering, I look for data with error bars. And they say, oh, well, the shadow goes in this direction. Well, what do you mean by direction? Because you're showing me a two-dimensional photograph.
Oh, that's obvious. What do you mean by direction?
Right.
This is like when I said, have you ever seen anything paranormal? And you're like, define paranormal, and you're keeping in your back pocket a lion G.I. Joe.
So
it's just like, you know what that means. Look. The thing
so you've got a three-dimensional environment, right? And the shadow is formed by the intersection of the surface of the three-dimensional environment with the lack of sunlight by some other thing. And so that shadow isn't, quote unquote, in a direction. You can't actually see sort of the pure part of the shadow. You can only see where the lack of light intersects some other object.
That's the shadow, though. You can't see the shadow. You can only see the lack of the light. That's the same thing.
At the intersection of some other thing, right? Okay. Shadows aren't like a two-dimensional surface. They're a volume of space that is lacking light.
Light, right.
So when you show me a photograph from the moon and say, well, the shadow's at the wrong angle, I go, well, what's the angle of the ground that the shadow is on? One of the problems that the lunar astronauts had was everything on the moon is the same color, almost the same color. It's all sort of gray. You don't have like green areas and blue areas and red areas, white areas, right? And the texture, because it's all this sort of dust, it's very hard to tell how far away things are. The astronauts regularly got distances confused, and they were looking with two eyes, right? So they had depth perception, and they were getting confused by an order of magnitude as to how far away things were. There's no identifiable shapes, no identifiable structures. It's just all gray dust in slightly sloping hills with boulders of different sizes scattered around. It's really hard to tell how far away things are. It's also hard to tell just how much ground is sloping in a particular direction, and considering that the sun is at an angle where it's basically illuminating all of the ground. So if you have ground that's going in different, if you have a slightly hilly area and you've got shadows hitting different parts of different hills, you're going to get shadows that to the camera's perspective look like they're going in different directions. But that doesn't actually mean that if you were to take if you were to be in sort of God mode and you were hovering over the whole site, you would have been able to see that the shadows were all directed away from the sun. But if you're down near the topography, and the astronauts didn't have a good measure of that topography, we know, because they kept screwing it up. And I'm just sort of asking the question, do the people on the ground 30 years later, did they have a better idea of what the topography is? Because I don't see them overlaying the topographical data. And I'm kind of like, what instrument did you use to make the measurement of the topography that proved that it was the way that you assumed that it would be?
No.
So because one of the things I do when I look at...
Look, here's the thing. So on Earth, we have irregular topography. And if there's only the sun as your only light source, shadows around you, basically, if you're on a relatively flat place, right, they all sort of, yes, they converge at infinity because parallel lines do that.
There were almost no parallel lines on the moon mission.
Right, which is the problem.
tell you, the design,
parallel shadows.
there weren't many parallel lines in the design and construction of the equipment that was there. Not many. There were a few, but there weren't many.
No. The parallel, I mean, like, so if you have one light source, your shadows, if there's one light source an infinite distance away, and I know it's not infinite, but for practical purposes, the sun was, okay, then the light coming in at you, if you have an object over here and an object over there, the shadow should be cast in the same direction. But on some of these moon photos, the shadows are at almost like a 45 or even greater. They're like sort of pointing at each other really close, indicating there's more than one light source illuminating the scene. Because
no,
you
again,
get shadows from different
don't
angles.
know what the topography is. You can't tell from the photograph what the topography was, other than the fact that you may be able to use the differences in the angles of these shadows to tell you what the topography may have been. There aren't markers there on the moon that tell you, oh, well, this area is a hill and that's not. If you can't tell from looking at it, which is all you've got in the photos, and as I said, the material is all the same, there's no distinguishing marks, it's evenly illuminated, it's going to be very, very difficult to discern the topography on the moon, especially from a two-dimensional photograph. So if you want...
No, because you can see it looks like, okay, they're in a flat place.
Again, you can see it looks like, and you can't tell the difference.
Well, then if I can't even tell flat from hilly on the moon, then the moon photos mean nothing.
I think that's the point he's making, is that it's a very low fidelity visual information environment.
The astronauts regularly, there was one point, I think Apollo 17, they were like, well, we're just going to walk over to that boulder and we'll come right back. And they start walking, and a few minutes later, they're still going, and they're still going. It turns out that boulder's like a mile away and is like 3 stories tall. And they thought it was like a 2-foot boulder. They couldn't tell how far away it was. And oftentimes they would get the angle wrong on stuff. They'd think, oh my gosh, this is a 40-degree slope. Like, we're going to slip down this thing if we go there. And then they come back from mission control and they're like, no, we've done the numbers and it's a 10% slope. And so they start walking the thing and they're like, oh, it is just a 10% slope. Like the visual environment on the moon made it very, very difficult for them to tell what the topography was.
But I'm not buying that it looks flat, but it's actually a 50-degree hill. One
of our mutual friends told me before I went to JPL, he was like, look, when you're driving out west through Texas, there's this place where he was like, oh yeah, I went to what this guy exaggerates everything. And I thought he was exaggerating. He was like, I started driving and we went west and there was this mountain. I was like, well, we're going to pass that mountain in like 5 minutes. And it just kept going. We kept driving. An hour later, the mountain's still in front of us. And then we turned and we never got to the mountain. I was like, well, that's ridiculous. This guy exaggerates on everything. And then I got on I-10 and I started driving west through Texas and I got out and the same thing happened to me.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Front of me, an hour later, still in front of me. I never get there. Probably the mountain was in Mexico. I don't know.
That totally happens in the desert. There's this. I mean, I get the perspective thing can be thrown off because I've been in the desert and looked at things, and it's like that's fine.
Okay.
But in the desert, I've never been walking and been like, this looks flat, but actually is a giant hill.
Well, that's because the visual environment is something that your eyes and brain are very good at making sense of here, and its point is it's not so on the moon.
The desert sort of looks like the moon,
but
like
you have no light. You have no light diffusion.
In the middle of the night at the moon.
But if you have no light diffusion, you have no secondary shadows, and the areas of shadow are totally without any light, right?
Right.
Because Earth shadows, you can still see into them a bit, and it gives you a little bit more data to work with to determine what's the shape of the thing making the shadow. But if the shadow is completely zeroed out,
shadows, you can see into them a bit too, apparently, because you can see the guy climbing up the ladder of the lander, even though he's on the shadow side. Yeah, it just seems like obfuscation to me to be like, well, you can't. The moon is so different that everything you see in the photos is actually like an optical illusion. But also, these photos prove that we went to the moon, even though you can't. It's weird.
The point is, no one has been able to supply data that proves that they didn't do it. And
which you could do if they told you what stars they saw. But as the one falsifiable thing, and they didn't do it. That's my problem.
I was looking at a photo taken on the moon, and I saw a dot next to the Earth, and I was like, gosh, wouldn't it be cool if I could identify that dot? And I zoomed in, I got the high res version of the photo, and it was a very red dot. And I'm like, there's like 3 things that could be. It could be Mars, it could be Jupiter, it could be Betelgeuse. And other than that, if I don't know the exact moment the photo was taken, and I don't know the exact orientation of the camera at the time it was taken, it's going to be nearly impossible for me to figure it out. But if I can't see any other stars in the photo,
day it's on and roughly the time of day, which you would know on a space mission because everything is highly written down. You could determine whether it was like they're not that close. You could say like this is that red body or this red body. Right? You have all the time and dates. That's the thing. The time and dates of everything on these Apollo missions is painstakingly recorded. Do you know Ken Mattingly personally?
Who of the conspiracy theorists is going to bother to look that up and compute the quaternion of the orientation and run the transformation?
You realize how autistic these people are. That would totally be done if it was available. Okay, but do you know Ken Mattingly personally?
No.
Okay, well, I gotta find
my
him.
grandfather did.
Okay, well, see if you can get a hold of him via your sources. He's gonna come on the show, and I'm gonna yell at this old Apollo astronaut and call him a liar.
I don't know.
And it's gonna be great. It's gonna be great programming. No,
don't recommend.
I will talk with him in a very respectful tones. I'll be like, look, Ken Mattingly, I know it was the Cold War. I know you had to give some propaganda to defeat the Soviets. I don't blame you for lying, but just admit it before you die, and then your soul will be good with God.
It reminds me of the joke when they brought John Glenn on Frasier, and the joke is he's going to be on a program, and he gets in there, and they accidentally get him talking about space aliens, and he does this and the people are having an argument in the control booth, and they miss the whole thing, and he accidentally admits. The joke is he accidentally admits that it was space aliens, and he met them, and they were very nice, but they're very dangerous, And then he realizes what he's saying, and he comes into the control booth, and he interrupts their argument. He's like, "Did you get that all on tape?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we were recording." He's like, "I'm going to need that back." It's like, what do you think is going to happen here?
But you know what the thing is? That actually happened. That's the weird thing. Gordon Cooper, the NASA astronaut, is on camera saying, "Oh yeah, when we were doing test flights, a UFO landed and alien men got out, and I videotaped it, and then the government took my film away." And the real master astronaut that went to space says this publicly, and people are like, "Huh?
Why don't I have that clip on the soundboard? That would have been great."
Look, when I was in grad school,
Google Gordon Cooper UFO, and he will go on. He'll just go on. He's dead now, sadly. He died in 2004. But he would be like, "Oh yeah, there was aliens, and when I was in space, I saw some." And it's like, what? This is what makes me question the whole thing, because it's full of this craziness.
Look, here's the thing. All the projects that I worked on in grad school that got funded were funded by the Air Force. Now they're breaking the space research up into Space Force, but the Air Force is funding all of the space stuff. They are 100% okay with you believing that it's space aliens. 100% okay with you believing that. They would much rather you believe that than figure out what's really going on. What's really going on is there's enemy spacecraft and enemy aircraft that they can't identify, and that's what you call a UFO. And they can't figure out what it is either. And they don't want you to know that they can't figure out what it is. Some of it's our spacecraft and our aircraft, and they don't want you to know what it is, and they don't want the enemy to know what it is. So they're fine with you promoting the idea that it's aliens. There's situations where it really is a weather balloon, and you just don't know what you're talking about. I've been on, we had a weather balloon team at Auburn. I've been on the team that did that, and it's a lot of fun. A lot of things can go wrong, and it's very easy to misidentify things when they're very small, very far away, and some of it is essentially camera tricks based on perspective. I've seen programs on TV and they're like, "It's aliens." No, it was police lights refracted through a what's the word, in the desert, and the layers of heat refract the
swamp
rocks.
gas. Swamp
it was
gas.
a mirage of
No,
what?
sorry.
Like what?
Swamp gas.
Swamp gas.
Swamp gas.
Look. Okay. Definitely, though, I understand. Look, let's not go down the UFO road. But some UFOs are way more weird than just like, oh, it was a light. And they cannot be simple human technology. It's just not possible.
All the things that they say.
I don't know what they are. I'm not saying they're aliens, but there are some things that appear in the sky that it is impossible for people to have made. I'm just leaving it at that. And Gordon Cooper, again, one of the Mercury astronauts was like, oh, yeah. And, and there was another one, too. There's like 3 or 4 NASA astronauts that are like, oh, yeah, when I was in space, aliens. And what the heck is going on?
Wasn't this the plot to one of the Transformers movies? And they brought in Buzz Aldrin, and he was like, well, these are the aliens we met on the moon, and it's the Transformers.
I know, that's the thing. But the thing is, this plot of the Transformers, you have real astronauts saying, oh, yeah. And then it's like, do you believe anything that NASA says now? I don't know, maybe. But it gets really weird. Anyway, thank you for coming on, Rocketman. I'm glad we all agreed that the moon landing was fake and that Ken Mattingly was a big liar.
Wait,
still is. Ken Mattingly, if you will come on the show, we will fist fight personally.
Wait, but before we go, we got a JPL guy here. We gotta ask if all the weird freak show stuff that I've heard about Jack Parsons is true.
I don't know that person by name.
Well, no, he was the old JPL dude before your time, but he was supposedly a legend, Jack Parsons, but he was into like occult stuff and all kind of weird, like designing rockets with spirits and things. No, nothing.
I'm not familiar. Sorry, I'm really bad with names. I don't know that I've heard of anybody like that.
Every single rocket was designed with the help of spirits. That's actually true, even if you don't realize it, because people don't know what spirits are. But anyway.
Okay.
If by spirits you mean the old Greek word pneuma, which actually means fluids, and since you need fluids to build a rocket engine, you mean the rocket engine.
No, I mean intelligent, disembodied wills and stuff. But
oh, gosh.
Look, as Thomas Aquinas used to say, the entire material world is under the control of angels. It's just true. I'm just leaving it there. And people don't know what angels are, so they get all confused.
I'm forcing the lead out.
All right, so we're all in agreement then that I was right. Is that what we're ending? The moon.